Well, hello, and thank you for joining us on today's special event as we bring 4 industry thought leaders to the table to discuss the ongoing issues and challenges related to cybersecurity and what organizations can do to mitigate risk. I'm Carol Flag of Answers Media Network. We appreciate your time today. Today's webinar is sponsored by Kuma. Kuma is a global privacy and security consulting company with the credentials and expertise to help your organization develop a best-of-breed privacy and security program and make a deliberate commitment to security and privacy excellence. Learn more at www.kuma.pro. Our moderator today is no stranger to Answers Media Network or Healthcare Now Radio. Matt Fisher is a partner in the law firm of Myrick O'Connell. Matt focuses his practice on health law and all areas of corporate transactions, including advising clients on complying with requirements of HIPAA, the Stark Law, the Anti-Kickback Statute, and other regulations in the context of daily operations, contractual arrangements, and relationships. He's a co-chair of the American Bar Association Health Law Section's Distance Learning Committee and a vice chair of both the Emerging Issues in Health Law Conference Planning Committee and the Marketing Committee. Matt also hosts our popular Healthcare Du Jour, our radio and podcast show that airs on Healthcare Now Radio. Learn more about Matt at www.myrickoconnell.com. And now to introduce our panelists. Our panelists today include Jen Behrens, a partner and EVP of Privacy at Kuma, where she specializes in privacy and identity management. Jen focuses on supporting organizations in transition from compliance to commitment in privacy and security excellence, and has led the privacy engineering and risk management efforts for multiple government agencies and within the commercial marketplace. She is currently engaged as a CISO for multiple major healthcare systems, leads CPO and DPO engagements, and has successfully led organizations through several security and privacy incidents. She has also served on the HIMSS Patient Identity Integrity Workgroup and is a sought-after speaker on the national landscape. Parham Eftekhari is the Executive Director of the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, or ICIT, the nation's leading cybersecurity think tank. Combining 15 years of technology experience with a lifelong passion for leadership and community engagement, Parham advises executives in some of the world's top public and private sector organizations to build strategic alliances and create thought leadership programs focused on national security, cybersecurity, and digital transformation. He is responsible for managing the Institute's content strategy, which consists of research publications, executive briefings, and digital engagement initiatives. In this capacity, he regularly engages with the media and has contributed to national publications and has developed or led over 100 educational briefings and events at institutions including TEDx, Congress, the World Bank, RSA, ISC2, and C-SPAN. And rounding out our panelists for today is Dave Summit, the Chief Information Security Officer at the H. Lee Moffitt Cancer Center and Research Institute in Tampa, Florida. Prior to his role at Moffitt, Dave held the CISO role with the University of Alabama at Birmingham Health System and Manager of Information Security at Bayfront Medical Center in St. Pete, Florida. He has a 21 federal career with the Department of Defense, which preceded his entry into the healthcare security sector. He's also a fellow with the ICIT and is a member of the Forbes Technology Council and serves as an advisor to the Center for Cyber Safety and Education. Like our other panelists and moderator, Dave speaks on the national level at various cybersecurity events on a range of topics, including building security teams and cyber awareness to roles and responsibilities of CISOs, as well as providing recommendations and insights into cyber threats and incident response. All right, panelists. Matt, I'm going to turn today's conversation and roundtable over to you. Thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you briefly after the event.
All right, thank you, Carol, and thank you, everyone, for joining today. I think we'll just kick our discussion off with what seems to be one of the most common questions that arises, which is, why does healthcare seem to either lag behind other industries when it comes to security, or, kind of a parallel to that, why does it seem to be a more frequent target for attacks than other industries? And Jen, if you'd like, how about you lead off this question?
Sure, and I'll come at it from the target aspect. Before I dive into that, I do want to thank everyone for participating in this and for this wonderful session. This is certainly a hot topic out in the market with a lot of organizations that I work with in the healthcare sector. Not only are they target rich because of the types of data that they have, all that wonderful protected health information that covers all sorts of information from your medical information to other traditional PIs such as Social Security numbers, but then also pharmaceutical and beneficiary information, as well as health payment information. So there's just a wealth of information that traditionally resides in healthcare organizations, making it a target-rich environment. But then increasingly what healthcare organizations these days are also doing is networking and integrating with non-traditional healthcare platforms that also then bring in other types of data fields such as social determinants of health, and then you start looking at the systems having varying levels of security and interoperability, which could provide holes and gaps and various opportunities to either have a rigorous security control regime over the integrations or provide significant gaps and holes. And so the healthcare industry of today has just such a massive amount of valuable data out there that it becomes a very ideal place for hackers or fraudsters to go looking to further their own malicious intent.
Yeah, so completely agree. You know, one observation I have as an institute, we focus on a number of different critical infrastructure sectors, healthcare being one of them, and one, you know, from our perspective, I don't necessarily believe that the health sector is ahead of the curve or behind the curve in terms of their response to these threats. You know, when we look at it, I don't think it's fair to necessarily say that healthcare is not responding fast enough. I think every sector is not responding fast enough. I think we'll have a lot of time to talk about the threats that are facing the healthcare sector, particularly whether we're talking about software, medical devices, operational technology, right? IoT or IIoT, whatever we want. There's a lot of, I guess, blame to go around, but we can have those same types of conversations, whether this is a panel discussing financial sector. CIT just put out a paper today on threats to our nation's airports, and the vulnerabilities that exist, the root cause of those can be traced back often to the same cultural problems that exist on the part of manufacturers, on the part of the business leaders that are oftentimes driving decisions and maybe you know, holding back the actions that security practitioners within hospitals and insurance companies and folks within these different ecosystems want to drive forward, but maybe can't because the CFO isn't providing funding and these types of things. So, you know, Jen's absolutely right. But, you know, from my, in terms of the vulnerabilities that exist, I would say that I don't know if the healthcare environment is necessarily ahead or behind the curve. I just think it's another sector that needs to prioritize and elevate security in terms of truly mitigating risk and getting ahead of the bad actors, whether it's nation states or cyber criminals or whomever we're talking about. Oh, Dave, I think you're on mute.
Yep, so I was. Sorry about that. So first, thank you for having me participate on this panel. A lot of great questions coming up, and I'm sure the discussions are going to be just as good. Jen mentioned the threats against the healthcare sector, and I think it's really a two-point discussion question about is healthcare lagging and why healthcare when it comes to being targeted. One, I think, is a result of the other. I've been in the healthcare industry now for about a little over 8 years, and when I first came in, we were lagging very, very badly. And I do believe there's been a major catch-up, but just in the last few years. I think it's going to continue to catch up. There's just been a whole slew of reasons why healthcare is perceived to be behind. A lot of different types of reasons, from budgetary reasons to even probably, in my case, the more serious one of not having enough qualified people to be in the healthcare security arena to even give the education to healthcare leaders of what do we do about this. But because of that, and because we're so target rich, that I think is why it's perceived that healthcare is behind. Because if the bad actors believe healthcare is behind, and they're so rich in the environment for the data that they could potentially infiltrate or do, then that's the reason why they're going to go after us. So I think we're catching up, and that's the good news about the healthcare sector.
So Dave, kind of picking up on the point you just made about the perception of the attackers that healthcare is lagging, and I think all of you are kind of making the point, which is that might not necessarily be true. It almost sounds like it could become a self-perpetuating issue if that perception exists, because then the attackers will more frequently target the healthcare industry, since they think the likelihood of success would be higher than in other places.
So, I look at that, and you have to consider the healthcare sector across the board. You've got large organizations in the healthcare sector, and all the way down to 3 or 4 person provider clinics or offices, right? So you still have the same type of data in each one of these, and it becomes less about the privacy of, as much as I don't like to say it, it becomes less about the privacy of the patients and the stuff that's going on as it is to these cyber threats that are against the organization that could eventually or potentially interrupt the patient care of the organization. So if I've got a small, if I have a small provider office that's not up on security, yep, they're probably a great target and a low-hanging fruit to go after to grab whatever data they have, but it's going to be a much smaller data set than it is a larger organization that may not be doing the right things at the right time. So which one do you pick? And again, it comes back down to the understanding of the organization and the budget. I mean, let's face it, security is adding healthcare costs across the board. If organizations have to spend money on security, healthcare is going to go up in cost. So that's also, on everyone's mind, and it really starts playing into all of this when it is a for-profit healthcare organization, because there's also bottom line that you have to think about.
Yeah, and I would, just to piggyback on that a little bit, I think, one of the brilliant aspects of HIPAA when it was written was that while it envisioned certain security controls should be applied for all types of entities and scope, it recognized that there would be budget and risk tolerances that smaller organizations may not be able to abide by. And so making some of those standards addressable, such as encryption. However, you speed up 20 years later, and there are now such advances that there are platforms and solutions that are more readily available at lower price points for smaller organizations. And I think that's some of the catch-up that Dave has referenced, is that healthcare organizations are playing over the last decade, is now that they have solutions that they might be able to tolerate from a fiscal position with these smaller entities, that they can now make these advances to safeguard the protected health information and EPHI in a more robust manner. That said, a little bit of it is, now we have such a robust market of tools, it can be overwhelming to healthcare providers to know how to implement, and then also, to Dave's point, the resources that are available to implement. And so it becomes a little bit of the tail wagging the dog on it. But I think, again, I would agree and concur that healthcare on the whole is progressing and maturing in their security life cycle, and certainly in their expectation of protecting medical information. Medical information is the most valuable on the black market right now. Protected health information more than other types of even credit card information or financial data. So you have both kind of sides of those weighing into the security profile of healthcare.
And just to dovetail off that, we so many of these conversations naturally lead to you were talking about the solutions available and why that's adding to what Dave was saying in terms of healthcare kind of catching up. that's where this whole conversation of moving either services to the cloud, where smaller organizations don't have to worry about security themselves, they can trust their cloud provider, or larger organizations can outsource some of those cloud vendors. And we just had a conference last week, it was for the government, where we talked about digital transformation and how transforming your organization can ultimately help with automation of certain cybersecurity and other functions to free up resources. So there's a lot of different, to your comment, Jen and Dave, a lot of the technology and the technological advances that we're seeing can, if implemented correctly based on, in this context for this conversation, your risk tolerance, can actually help to free up those resources and through automation and things like that, or just outsourcing the security functionality to a certain extent to your cloud vendors to address some of the cyber resource constraints and challenges that Dave was referring to earlier.
So kind of building off the points that all of you are raising about the availability of, or the increasing availability of tools, and arguably the increasing reach to get those tools in terms of cost, what is an effective way to actually implement the tools? Because I think it was a consistent comment from each of you that organizations can become overwhelmed with the choices, and Parham, your mention of being able to migrate to the cloud. It's before you do that, and I don't disagree that the cloud has a very big role, you want to make sure you're carefully vetting whoever you're going to be using as a vendor too, to make sure they understand the needs of your business, as well as if we're talking about healthcare, it always comes back to HIPAA. So to make sure that they understand that, since not every cloud vendor out there necessarily fully understands it. So I guess to circle back around to the actual question, which is how can these organizations effectively implement and utilize these tools to enhance their security posture? And I'll turn it over to Dave first, since you had kind of introduced that concept of the cost pressure.
So it's very expensive to be doing security in a healthcare organization. We have such a wide range of applications and systems that it is very overwhelming at times and very difficult to keep up with it. There's also an idea, or I believe a misconception, about moving things to the cloud within healthcare, in that it's not the same as a non-healthcare sector, where you're in essence you're kind of transferring security risk to the cloud vendor for their security. But in the healthcare world with HIPAA, I'm still responsible for that data, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's sitting on-prem. So I'm not transferring any risk. I'm just trying to reduce my cost of taking care of the security control. And that's a very tough thing, because we sometimes have to make decisions on whether to use a cloud vendor or provider when we don't necessarily have enough information into that cloud vendor, or they have such a system to where if we do ask questions, they're not quite completely open to letting us know how things operate. So that's the toughest place, and one of the toughest decisions I had to make when the organization's coming to me for cloud operations. And when I'm asked how do I feel about it, it really is almost subjective against every CISO and every different organization, and that's a tough thing. So it still does all come back down to cost. I mean, let's face it, healthcare, patient care is going to trump over anything that we do, and if it impacts patient care, then we have a bigger battle on our hands, and it's up to us to educate our leaders and our providers into what the real risk is by doing the actions we're getting ready to do, and whether or not they're willing to accept those risks or not.
And I would also further the careful consideration of the type of services that organizations will use for their cloud or managed services. Like Dave, I work with clients in various stages who have on-prem, or they're co-located, or they're moving to the cloud, and sometimes it can appear by selecting a managed service provider for your cloud environment that it sounds like a great bundle that you can hire a company to host and manage your environments, and it looks on the surface like they're doing all of the security. They have a scene console, they're doing IDS, they have logging and monitoring and scans and tests running, and but unless you're actually putting the same level of rigor into understanding their security profile and the activities that they're actually going to do, the cadence and the reporting cycles and the rigor behind those, you may just be standing up an environment that has a capability that you actually then need to manage those controls yourself. And so I'm seeing that sometimes with clients is they think they're buying the full package when they're not, and then they have environments spun up in cloud accounts, which is perfectly reasonable and architected appropriately from the technology perspective, but they're not hardened. There's no actual configuration in place. But they've been relying on this vendor who has their own secure environment. And so you just have to manage the intent behind what you're actually procuring, and then understand if you're still going to have your in-house or external resources to manage that. I'm a proponent of, even if you have a managed service provider, you coordinate your own security configuration and management tools on top of theirs. And it takes more effort and more planning, but if you can hold on to the administrative control of your tools, then you really know what's going on. But you have to have the awareness and insight to check on those things, or to make sure that if you really want to push it off, that you actually push it off on someone who's going to do it.
Yeah, and this is Dave brought up a really good point with respect to and Jen's building off on this, essentially trusting the third party, your cloud provider with your data or with your applications. There's an initiative right now in the Department of Defense called Deliver Uncompromising. It's a report written for MITRE. Now, this is specifically for the defense industrial base, but essentially they're looking to add security as a fourth pillar in the acquisition process. And what they're essentially saying is that, look, we're the biggest defense buyer in the world, and we're no longer going to be okay with you, having less security than is acceptable to us. And so we are going to require that you deliver uncompromised software. I think I was told somewhere that 70% of all defense acquisitions are actually just software now, which is maybe not on topic here, but it's kind of interesting to me. The point I'm trying to make here is that it may not be relevant right now to the smaller folks on this call, but in the healthcare environment, you always need to remind particularly large healthcare institutions, these buyers have power. And if you're not getting the answers that you want from your healthcare providers, these guys are out there, yes, they're trying to provide a good service to you, but they're trying to make money. And if you hang that over their head, that carrot over their head saying, if you don't give me what I want in my EULA or terms and conditions or SLAs, I will take this $1 million or multi-million-dollar or $100 million contract and take it to your competitor, unless you give me that visibility, that insight, that kind of standard that I expect. You will be surprised as to what they will get. I have multiple examples that I've been hearing in the government sector for years, that these CIOs and CISOs have kind of taken that harder approach, and all of a sudden they'll be getting these custom SLAs that their peer agency didn't get, and it's just because they flex that buying power. And what will happen eventually, kind of as part of the supply chain ecosystem, is those cloud providers, if they start to see that enough of their customers are asking for this, they may just make that a standard practice. And now what those larger entities have done is actually created a more secure cloud service for the smaller folks who can just reap the reward. So I think what Dave and Jen are talking about are really important, and that's how an industry as a whole can actually affect change for the greater community. And I think it starts with kind of demanding more from your cloud providers.
Yeah, no, and Parm, that is a very good and interesting point to make. It's because I think it's so often natural a natural response is you get presented with a contract, and then you're not maybe not necessarily focused on those particular terms. You're just trying to look at the cost and other more maybe bigger ticket items from a typical viewpoint. But I think you're right. It's if you can be able to push your presence in the market to say, no, this you're providing a service to me. I'm trusting you with a sensitive piece of my operation. You kind of need to meet me where I'm trying to go. Definitely makes sense.
Yeah, don't be afraid to, sometimes you can't, but if you can, don't be afraid to walk away and say, I'm going to go elsewhere if you have that option. I think more of us in every sector need to be willing to do that. If you're the Department of Defense, you have a little bit of a bigger stick to, to do that with. But I think, that's one thing that it would be great to see the largest healthcare organizations come together and start to demand those things. If they're not doing it already, I don't want to speak out of line, but I think those are the things that we can start doing to require higher standards of security on the part of these cloud providers.
Yeah, and I would say it's, I suspect that some of the large systems are doing it, but, kind of the experience I've had is they do it by just saying, here, you need to sign our template agreement, which then is completely inapplicable to the service oftentimes that they're actually trying to obtain. So it kind of, I guess, from that perspective, it does need to be a little bit of a two-way street of when you're going out and acquiring the service, recognize and understand what you're actually attempting to contract for, and don't just try to fit a round peg into a square hole. I think we've touched upon this a little bit so far, but it's, and I think, Jen, you might have been the one who brought it up, but it's, some of the security risk that we're seeing is just the expansion of what is being used within healthcare, whether you're talking different business partners or probably more realistically different tools and devices, and that goes both to the known and unknown devices, I would say. Thinking about bring your own device type issues, a system might not even be aware of every single device that's hooking into its system. So I'd kind of like to pivot us into that realm, which arguably is not a new problem, but is one that I think just keeps building and building. So I'd like to get each of your perspectives on where you see the complications around say BYOD or Internet of Things and different devices, and and then hopefully lead us into a discussion of what can be done to help alleviate the risk. And I'll let Parham lead off this time because I don't think you've had a chance yet to be the lead on a question.
Sure, that's okay. Yeah, so I think you're talking about visibility onto networks. I think the growing kind of IoT microcosms within organizations is a big challenge. Essentially, how can you protect what you don't know? And I think it comes from multiple areas. You have individuals bringing rogue devices and plugging them into networks. I think an equally large threat is actually different business units who are buying devices that have internet capabilities and that are linking into the networks that the CIO isn't aware of and the CISO isn't aware of. And so how can the CIO and the CISO work together to protect those devices that are maybe being purchased by someone in operations or someone in some other business unit that wasn't procured through whether it's software or an IoT device or an IIoT, right, Industry 4.0 type device. That's ultimately somehow linking into the network. And so I think what you're talking about is just network visibility. There's two pieces to the security equation, and I think that's what kind of the second part of the conversation you want to have. One is essentially after the fact, right? These things are being manufactured by different organizations, different software or vendor companies or hardware or device companies. Right, we have to talk about the standard to which they're manufacturing or coding these items and how secure are they when they come off the production line, so to speak. And so what type of vulnerabilities are they introducing to the healthcare environment? So that's one piece of it. And then ultimately, once they get onto and into the environment, then what does the CISO and CIO, kind of the security team, need to do together to then protect it once it's in the environment? So there's two different, I think, pieces of two different, I guess, silos of conversations that need to be had to discuss securing, these devices.
From an IoT perspective, it's definitely an area that, when I'm asked that well-known question that seems to get every CISO, what keeps you up at night. IoT is definitely one of those areas. We have estimates of anywhere from 20 to 50 billion new devices by 2020 on the internet is all going to be IoT. Inside an organization, it increases just as exponentially as it's occurring just in the world. I mean, we're talking just personal medical devices that are now being thought about to be interfaced into the provider information. We're looking at video cameras on the network. We're looking at other biomedical devices that are now being networked in. And in a lot of cases, it's for a good benefit, but the problem that has typically been occurring is that there's been no requirement or any type of a push to have security built into those devices. I mean, let's face it, the vendors are there to make profit and to help out the healthcare industry. When you start introducing security, there's a cost that comes with that, and it's either going to make the cost of research go up or it's going to make the cost of selling it go up, which in turn is going to get passed on to us. So again, we're back to that same topic of increased security is going to be an increase of cost. So where do we draw that line, or where do we place that threshold? But definitely IoT is very much of a concern, and it really is based upon it coming into the environment and not understanding what risk we're actually throwing onto our healthcare network and what kind of problems we're going to see in the future or almost immediately when we even throw it on. So that is a major concern of ours.
Yeah, and I would echo, this is definitely an area that we work with a lot of our clients frequently on, managing devices as well as different applications that they may be integrating in their systems. A lot of it is making sure that your policies and procedures adequately cover and scope in additional devices, personal devices, if you're going to allow them, and then rolling out different solutions on those, MDM solutions and so forth, invoking MFA, requiring passcodes, passwords of certain complexity, even on these devices, and that everything is encrypted. But then even further than that, especially as more of these devices are connected on the back end and are on people's personal phones that may be that other apps sitting on that phone can collect information from. So understanding what's native, what's in your settings, and how any solutions that you may be putting on devices or utilizing from devices, what are those back-end handshakes that happen, and then what are not only the security controls that you need to look at for those, but what are the privacy implications about what type of information may be shared. One client I was working with recently was looking at some imaging tech for some of their patients, and wanted to look at using the camera on the phone as one of the ways to capture images. But if you start to read some of the T's and C's from some of the more well-known providers out there, they can access photos on people's phones. And think about how often you clean out your photos if you've taken pictures and uploaded to some document file or repository when you needed to interact with the system. And so when we're starting to connect a lot of these applications for ease and efficiency, we also need to think downstream to not only consider the security of these devices, but then also privacy implications about what data is captured, how it's authorized for that collection and access, who it can be disclosed to passively, so directly or indirectly, and all those nuances. And so it really becomes a very significant matter that you need to look at in a structured way, just as you would manage the risk profile from security, looking at invoking things like privacy impact disorders, privacy impact assessments, and formal privacy risk management programs to couple with the security. It's just how we're going to have to start thinking.
Yeah, if I may jump back in there, Jen brings up a really valid point, because I think all too often and too many times people kind of, they'll pour security and they'll pour privacy into the same bowl, and when it gets mixed up, it gets mixed up. And there's a big difference between security and the privacy side of the house. These personal devices absolutely warrants a look at the privacy side of what's being shared and what you're signing up to agree to be shared and what they're having access to on a personal device. And I've seen a huge shift in the time that I've been in the healthcare community, going from taking care of our patients' privacy and our employee privacy and moving it toward it's becoming more of a security problem in the aspect that if something goes wrong, it's going to impact operations and patient care and patient safety, and becomes more than just a privacy issue. And with all of these IoT devices now starting to infiltrate the healthcare network, we're introducing a lot of new windows, so-called windows, into our environment that potentially has an area of compromise that a person could use to jump into our network. And that's the area that I'm really concerned about from a healthcare organization standpoint of allowing BYOD and IoT devices on the network.
So kind of, Dave, to that point, are there means of being able to, I don't know, lock down the system or require permission before devices can be connected? And even if that is possible, does that just interrupt workflow too much?
So anytime you introduce a security control, there's going to be some kind of an impact. The real trick is to minimizing that impact. I try to go to as minimal impact as possible, but recognizing that it's still going to cause someone, someplace, a little bit of an interruption. Yes, it's possible, but again, we go back to the resource and we go back to the cost. And when you see healthcare organizations that are maturing more, they are doing just that. They're getting proper inventory of their network. They're tying down and not letting anything on the network until it goes through approval cycles and allowing them to be placed on the network, down to organizations that just don't have that in place, and someone can walk in and jump on the wireless or plug it right in, and now they're on your network. So again, it becomes that it becomes more important for the security organization or the security area of that organization to be doing their proper risk analysis to determine what the impacts could be if they bring something in.
Yeah, so kind of thinking about that connectivity and maybe expanding it out, there's a lot of discussion about interoperability and the ability, and enhancing the ability, because I would like to optimistically believe that this ability already exists to allow information to flow, whether it's between different areas of one organization or through different devices or among and across different organizations. So kind of what challenges does that introduce from the security perspective, which is obviously different from whatever kind of roadblocks or challenges are introduced about the concept of interoperability generally?
Was that directed at me, Matt?
I'd like to get all three of you to weigh in on this one, because it's I think expanding that discussion out. But if you'd like to lead off, Dave, I'm sure the others won't object.
Okay, so it does present its unique challenges, and I think this is where it's becoming more and more important for healthcare organizations to begin collaboration. Because let's just take for instance, if I have a very specific cyber management program for my organization, and I'm doing certain things that I'm going to be very pat on that this is the way I expect our connectivity or our standards to go, and I get another organization that CISO or that person responsible for their security has their ideas, I'm going to have a little bit of conflict there, and that's where we've got to get together as security professionals to begin working on this, to minimize that connectivity between each other and yet meet our own requirements for our organization. So collaboration is going to be key to all of that.
I concur. Collaboration is paramount, not only between organizations but within. So one of the things that I start working with organizations and that I recommend, especially healthcare organizations, do as they are bringing on different platforms or providers, but then also looking to extend that interoperability with non-healthcare scoped organizations such as schools or social services or government agencies, is to develop a framework of sharing that brings together your security, your privacy, and your legal teams, and making sure that you develop a cohesive framework approach to managing that risk within your own organization. But then as you work with other organizations to onboard and participate in your network, the goal is to make sure that the whole network has the overarching rigor in the security and privacy and then acceptance of legal risk between the actors. And getting a good foundation on that is critical. It also, if you start that conversation earlier, it actually can foster greater efficiency in getting the onboarding and the participation done. And it starts having that network effect amongst all the actors and organizations. But Dave's exactly right. Also, having the CISOs speak to the CISOs, and everyone wants the same thing. It's just a matter of how to get there. And the goal is to do it collaboratively with a robust program intact between all organizations.
ICIT recently published a report on responses to Senator Warner's questions that he sent to about, I guess, a dozen or so healthcare associations and organizations. They weren't sent to hospitals. I don't know if that's coming up or not. But in the responses that were received at the time that we published our report, and this is available on our website, go to icitech.org, in our publications tab, it's one of the top 4 ones, I think. One of the key takeaways from the first round of responses that were received was actually this very topic, just the industry's calling for more collaboration and governments and health and human services to actually step in and facilitate some of this collaboration for very much the reasons that both Dave and Jen have outlined. So they're both spot on, and industries talking about this, and we're seeing government actually ask for what they can do and the role that they can play in this process.
So I definitely agree that collaboration is both necessary and helpful, but arguably traditionally, when you're talking about at least the big healthcare players, collaboration wasn't always a focus, if on the table at all. Because the argument would go that each is always trying to maintain its share of a patient population or share in the market. So, do you guys see signs that those barriers to collaboration are falling, and are there specific examples? Or, I know Parham, you had just mentioned the fact that, based in response to the senator's call, you've got people saying, let's have HHS step in, or have, get something to drive it. So does there need to be some overarching agency like that to kind of force the initial stages of collaboration, or is stuff actually starting to happen in the real, kind of out in the real world in the wild by itself?
Yeah, I don't know if we need more, like another entity to be created. We have the ISACs, we have the ISOWs, the information sharing and analysis organizations, and that mechanism that was created maybe 3 to 5 years ago now. I think it was AdvaMed. Actually, in that same set of responses, they talked about the ISOW that they have created for its members, and that they're using it to do collaboration and information sharing within their that community. I don't know if we necessarily need new entities or a new kind of governing body. I think what needs to happen is the ones that exist, HHS, CMS, OCR. Right, whatever FDA, if we're talking about medical devices, whatever the objective of whatever the problem is that the community is trying to address, look at who the relevant stakeholders are, bring those folks together, and let's leverage the mechanisms that are in place. I think one of the barriers that may exist is that some of the models today may be cost prohibitive, particularly to some of the, I think it was Dave that mentioned earlier, You know, you have large healthcare organizations, and you have some that are 2 or 3, right? And they don't obviously have the ability or money to hire, you know, cybersecurity folks. They're obviously not going to be able to pay whatever it costs, $20,000, $30,000 to join an ISAC, right, a year. And so, how do we bring those folks into the collaborative process? How do we create tools to provide value to them? How do we make it accessible to them? So I think it's my personal, and the other folks may have a different opinion, but from everything I see, I don't believe that we need to be creating new. I think we should just take advantage of what's already out there and just deepen the strengths. And the other interesting thing that came out of the feedback process was removing, you know, right now there's basically penalties, right, for when folks are collaborating. If they basically reveal too much during the collaborative process, they may be penalized by some of the current regulations that are out there. Some of the comments that were made as part of the senator's request for feedback was, look, you know, we want to get together and collaborate on these issues, but, you know, let's take away some of the penalties that are out there if an organization can prove that it actually has basically done as much as it can from a security perspective, but maybe there was an incident anyway. So there's a lot of kind of considerations that go into play to make collaboration truly successful. You know, let's address some of those things from incentives and penalization processes and whatnot. I think that's kind of where I think we should go.
Yeah, and to that end, it's not recreating the wheel with creating new entities or organizations, but we are seeing new initiatives come out of the federal and various state governments. ONC has extended its comment period on TACA, which I usually get this wrong, but I believe it's the Trusted Exchange Framework Collaborative Agreement, maybe Cooperative Agreement. That's all about promoting interoperability amongst organizations and using healthcare organization networks to exchange and facilitate that information for better care coordination for individuals. And in that, it provides a series of tiered requirements from technical implementation, so, you know, from languages to protocols to also security as well, security controls, but then also certifications that are out there, and based on what type of organization you are and how you want to onboard. And so it's utilizing tools that have been out there, but it's reframing the approach and the support and incentives, to Parham's point earlier, and not providing barriers to it, but how to remove and pull those down. And now we're starting to see some states actually get on that too, on how to, and providing funding or grants for healthcare organizations to onboard and facilitate the exchange of information, and looking at various sizes of providers and types of healthcare organizations to onboard and into the networks or the ecosystems, which require various levels of security and privacy practices. And so, you know, we don't necessarily need new oversight agencies, but I think we need to have that shift in the approach. You know, I think healthcare came from very much a couple decades ago of locking everything down, making it very challenging to share information for the protection, because there were not viable protocols or the availability of mass market tools to use that would adequately protect the information. Now we're starting to see the shift to where we're looking at regulation and guidance that says, okay, now we want you to share this information because there are tools available and you can reasonably safeguard the information in an interoperable way. So now we're, you know, legislation always chases technology, and that's what's happening right now. And so now that we know we can do it, we need to facilitate and make it efficient for organizations to make that conversion as well. And that it's going to take a little bit of time, but it's exciting to see some of these initiatives coming out of the various organizations and agencies.
So kind of picking up on the point that you know, Jen and Parham, you were both making about, you know, seeing new initiatives either from federal government agencies or the states exploring options. what impact can we expect from, in this instance, I'm thinking most particularly of the states, of either new laws or new regulations coming out of the states. Obviously the California Consumer Protection Act has received a lot of attention, although arguably healthcare information, so long as it's subject to HIPAA, maybe falls outside of that, although I'm sure there's going to be complications because there always are. I also recall discussion about debate about a new kind of comprehensive law in Washington state as well. So, kind of what all you see in terms of the impact of those state laws, and is the potential for even greater 50-state variation going to negatively impact the ability to improve security and privacy? And Jen, I'll go over to you first.
You're exactly right. States are picking up different privacy regulations and continuing to expand their cybersecurity initiatives. I think West Virginia is looking at one, or recently passed a cybersecurity piece of legislation. States such as California and Washington have passed or are trying to pass privacy regulations, but there are also other states as well. I think there's somewhere upwards of 6 or 8 states have picked up privacy acts similar to CCPA, which are modeled off of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, out of the EU. However, there are, and so some of those have carve-outs, certainly, for agencies that are within scope of HIPAA. The interesting thing is you need to carefully consider what types of information you have and what types of services and programs you may be offering, because a lot of providers these days have a lot of non-traditional, not technically healthcare in scope of HIPAA data that may or may not be intermingled with PHI. And so whether you're technically within scope of some of these regs or not, you have to be very careful and consider if you want to comply with the spirit of the technicalities. However, there are also increasing state regulations that impact healthcare from areas that, or facets that you may not at first blush you need to consider, but things like Vermont's data broker law. So a lot of organizations use data brokers these days. And so there are now regulations regarding the utilization and management of data brokers. There are also, I think Illinois passed a biometric privacy regulation, but then also, it might be Illinois, and I might have gotten my state wrong on this one, but passed a device privacy regulation that impacts how the devices are set up and configured. And so if we're looking at IoT and medical devices, you should also start looking at privacy regs that are applicable to actual devices and the development and applications that are on those. And so there are just a host of privacy regulations that are picking up steam that don't traditionally or at first pass look like they are relevant to healthcare organizations. But as we've talked about throughout this whole panel session, is that healthcare is so wide and broad these days that it encompasses so many different aspects and touches so many different facets of daily life, from your phones to your medical devices to social determinants of health with perhaps food or housing support, pharmaceuticals, which again, some of those are edge cases on HIPAA, but if you're doing wellness studies, and it just kind of is this ever broadening scope that really at any point you can have a touch point with a privacy reg. Also understanding that your patients and your consumers may not necessarily be more sophisticated in understanding all the exchanges or technologies, but they're certainly much more savvy and aware that they should expect privacy protections in addition to things like encryption from their healthcare providers these days. And so considering how you want to either lean in or resist privacy is also a cultural consideration for healthcare organizations as the state of privacy in this country advances.
The one thing I'll add on the privacy area, privacy is not a huge area of expertise for me, but the one thing that I've been reading a lot about, the particularly the California piece of legislation, and some of the kind of criticisms, frankly, of it is, where it didn't go far enough. Just to build off of what Jen was saying, is the focus. It still puts the focus on consumers. At the end of the day, there's very few, I think, consumers who are going to take the time to go and almost protect themselves. And I think the question then comes to whose responsibility is it? Do we want to pass federal level legislation that's going to, at a federal level, force data brokers and the organizations that are collecting data to basically have the government mandate and regulate and do privacy on behalf of the consumers? Or we're going to have regulations that basically gives consumers the ability after the fact to go in and say, well, I know you've collected my data, but I don't want you to do this with it. And I think that's kind of an interesting observation I've been making, some of the research I've been doing. I know I personally kind of, my personal preference is on the side of let's have there be more regulation to protect consumers, because a lot of folks don't have the luxury of spending time to worry about these types of things, right? I might have that type of time, but a lot of Americans don't. And so I think we have to be looking out for those types of folks. But I think there's a lot of different opinions on what type of legislation works best. I do think that we do need a federal level legislation. It's just impossible for the burden on an organization to be in compliance with 50 different state privacy laws is just not realistic. So I think the Fed needs to step in at some point.
Yeah, and I would agree with Parham completely. I'm not up for more regulation. I think some regulation is absolutely necessary and required, especially when it comes to personal privacy, because just pick up your own smartphone and look at an app, and who in the world has time to go through and read the terms and agreements? And if you do, you almost have to have a legal degree to even understand what's being said. So at some point, that's where the regulations have to come in. And I think Parham made another excellent point too of where do we draw the line when I'm sitting here in Florida and I have to be watching not only the federal HIPAA law, but I've got Florida law, and because we have patients out of our state, I've got to be watching state laws. And it gets to a point where all we're doing is monitoring which law and which state we've got to be responsible to, when we need to be focusing more on our own security and privacy of our own organization instead of worrying about all that. So it really does get to a point where you become regulatory fatigue. It just sets in, and then you just kind of throw your hands up and you just don't know what to do. So my case, I just turn that over to our legal department and I concentrate on my security program.
Yeah, and I think kind of, Dave, that point that you're just making about, the fatigue that can generate if you just start turning it over to one team and saying, okay, this is, that group's concern, and keep doing that with every different component, all of a sudden no one can get the complete picture anymore. And, and I always think about, at least on the federal level, when a new regulation comes out, there's supposed to be that, the regulatory impact piece at the end of every proposed and final rule, where they talk about, this is the time and the cost burden. And when you look at it, sometimes you just start laughing, because it's, it seems so completely out of whack with reality in terms of how far it undershoots that impact. And, I think that kind of goes to the point that all three of you are making, which is, it is important to have a set of rules to follow, but let's get some type of common set of rules, so that way, everyone's playing on a level playing field, and you're not just, making everyone jump through compliance hoops instead of focusing on what is really important at the end of the day, which for healthcare is always comes back to being able to deliver care.
Absolutely. And I'm going to throw this in here, because I think with everything that's going on and all these privacy discussions throughout the different states and different countries, and what they're going to do and what they're not going to do about it, HIPAA really was a good baseline for everyone to kind of get as a level, as a level set. And back in 1996, it was geared more toward the the privacy side of it was more of a privacy side, and we have matured so far. I mean, in '96, you didn't hear a whole lot of discussions about cyber threats. You didn't hear a whole lot of discussions about cyber teams or security teams. It's matured that much. So here we are 20 plus years later, and if I look at that in technological lifetimes, I mean, we're looking at 11 to 14 lifetime changes in our technology since HIPAA came out. And it's now time for, and hopefully there's either some legislators listening in or their staffers, it's time for someone to pick that up and let's revisit HIPAA altogether.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting debate, and it's you know, I think it's important to have that debate instead of just letting one particular group necessarily run with it. Because I think the more stakeholders you can have involved in that discussion, you know, optimistically, the better solution that will come out of it at the end of the day. So, as we're already, you know, starting to get fairly close to the end of our time, you know, I'd like to start kind of wrapping things together, and you know, let's see if we can get some clear takeaways. And you know, I'd like to kind of go to each of you to maybe enumerate or highlight some best practices that you think organizations are utilizing or should be utilizing to help manage and reduce risk. So Parham, let's start with you on this one.
Sure. You know, I may answer this a bit differently. I'm not we're a research organization and a cyber think tank, so I think the way I'll answer this may be a bit different. I think one thing that I would recommend organizations do is, of course, get involved. We talked about collaboration earlier. There's a lot of great organizations. I'm biased. I think ICIT is one of them. But get involved in the organizations that are out there that are designed to foster collaboration, to build relationships. There was a lot of backlash, frankly, this year after RSA. People said it was way too focused on kind of the sales machine. I was there. I would agree. But outside of the vendor kind of chaos, there was a tremendous amount of value being had in the networking and the relationship building. There's organizations that put together venues for meaningful exchange of dialogue, of research, of best practices. Nothing beats getting folks both within your own.
Well, I guess while we wait for
back
Parham, Jen, do you want to pick it up?
Sure. I think some of the takeaways that I see organizations successfully managing their current security risk is it's a few things. So one, I think coordinating your security, privacy, and legal teams early on to have a governance framework to address interoperability and exchange of information within the organization as well as across organizations is paramount. And additionally, looking to embrace higher levels of security and privacy rigor, looking for external points of validation or verification, and those could be audits or certifications as well, that would harmonize across types of data sets, I think is beneficial. And honestly, something I work with organizations frequently on is risk management is really where it's at, and it's not going away. And part of that is everyone has their risk assessment, and they're going to share their risk assessment with onboarding participants. There are going to be requirements to complete these. Everyone should be assessing risk. Your goal is to minimize the impact of current risk within your system, but then reduce the likelihood of accepting new risk into your system by working with or exchanging data with other entities or using different programs or solutions and applications. And so the only way that you can actually manage that is to be able to make risk-informed decisions, which means making sure you have inventories and assessments of exactly where that risk sits, which can be compliance assessments, security control checks, and those sorts of things. But risk management's not going away. It's really the only way to tackle some of these things, and it's a way of life at this point. So I really encourage organizations to really embrace it and start seeing how managing security and privacy can be an enabler for interoperability. Now that, again, we have those tools that are available for organizations to use, we should be really fostering the utilization application of those so that we can exchange data in a meaningful way to promote patient care and coordination.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Jen on this one. The risk assessment area is the key. It does so much for so many things, from getting you your own, pretty much your own profile of your organization, but it also helps you to prioritize what really matters and what things that you should be letting go. We're all resource strapped, and if we're trying to fix everything everywhere, we're never going to gain. So if we focus our attention on what's high threat, what's high probability, we have a much better chance of coming out of this thing well ahead. I would also encourage any CISOs that are listening, or the managers or the teams that might be listening right now, go out and talk to your leadership. Get involved with your leadership and understand what they're thinking. Most of the time, they're eager to have that talk with you. And they're very eager to learn what's really going on. I've seen that huge shift in senior leadership in organizations taking this very seriously and needing to understand what's going on. So that's an area that also falls into collaboration. Get involved. If you're a healthcare organization, get involved with the healthcare ISAC. That helps out tremendously. You have a whole range of people out there that can give you information or just run something by them. Start up your own local groups. We here in the Tampa area, all of our healthcare groups here in the area are getting together kind of regularly and talking about what problems they're having and what threats they're seeing, and we have communications constantly. At the same time, do that collaboration inside your own group. Don't just be a siloed security group in your organization. Get with legal, get with compliance, get with your privacy people, get with your risk people, and start talking to them about the impacts that cyber has on them and that they have on cyber. I just encourage everyone to do that, because I think the more we make people aware, the better off we are in making a security program efficient and one that will work correctly. So that's kind of what I have.
And it looks like we've got Parm back. So I know you got cut off a little bit, but let's turn the floor back over to you, Parm.
I'm going to keep it short in case I get cut off again. The last, aside from collaboration, I was going to say everyone just needs to speak up. I kind of hinted on this before, but the end of the day, all these vulnerabilities that we need to protect or defend against, a lot of them are coming from irresponsible development practices on the part of software manufacturers or device manufacturers. And so everybody listening and everybody out there needs to start to speak up and demand that these developers prioritize security and put security over profits. This is kind of a big problem that we're facing. We talk about this a lot at the Institute. And I think if these developers and manufacturers realize that all of you are buying based on security as a priority, and that you'll take your dollars elsewhere if you don't feel that a certain device or software is not secured to your standards, they will start to realize that security is a marketing differentiator, and they will elevate security and won't view it as a cost of doing business, but actually as a business advantage, and we'll start to see more secure products coming out in the first place. So please start to do that. That'd be a recommendation from us.
I think those are a lot of good practices and tips, and kind of what I'd like to do to be able to close this out is put each of you on the spot a little bit and provide an example that each of you has encountered where there was some type of jaw-dropping or unbelievable security incident where you couldn't believe that had happened, and then kind of what lesson you took away from that to be able to improve either the advice that you give going forward, or maybe thinking specifically about obviously without naming names, to help that organization that you're working with, or it could even just be a frustration that you'll hope others will learn from. Because kind of one that I always like to give, and it's I've seen it in a couple different instances, is an incident happens it has to get reported to the Office for Civil Rights because there's HIPAA implications. You're sweating bullets through the investigation, and then the investigation finds some deficiencies, and then I can't get anyone to give me a call back to actually update and implement necessary policies and procedures. It kind of goes to that resource issue that we've talked about throughout, but it's still one that it always surprises me whenever it happens, because it's I always like to say it's going to be much more efficient to try and address it up front than to have another incident happen, because even though fines are issued in the vast minority of instances, if you become a repeat offender, that's never a good thing when you're in front of the regulators. But I will turn it over to Dave to kick us off on this final piece.
That's an interesting question, because I've got so many that I could pull from. I don't even know which one to pull from. There's a lot of frustrations in this field, and with every organization. The only thing that I can even begin to probably share my frustration with most of the time is learning from something that should have been caught and was caught. But the frustration level comes in when the organization doesn't understand that when you catch something, there's a learning piece from it instead of a why did you find that for us to take care of moment. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but there's a lot of times when we in the security field are doing things to look for something that may be bad and wrong, and if you find it, it's not very welcomed. But that's what makes your security program stronger in the long run.
Parham.
Ironically, a little bit similar to what Dave was going to say. I'm not a CISO, so I don't personally deal with these issues, but I speak with a lot of CISOs as part of my role. And I think the thing that shocks me the most and frustrates me the most is the amount of time that, and this isn't specific to the healthcare sector only, just across the board, but organizations hire CISOs, and essentially there's two types of organizations, one that want the CISO to actually come in and do something for security, and ones that just have them as window dressing to say, like, look, we have a CISO, we care about security. And then behind the scenes, when the CISO goes, okay, here's my plan, here's what I want to do, and I need money to do vulnerability assessments, then the CFO or the president is like, well, we don't have any incidents. Why would we don't need to do vulnerability assessments. And it's like, well, it's because you don't have the tools to identify where the vulnerabilities are. You don't have any because you're not doing any sort of testing to identify where your vulnerabilities are. And then all of a sudden the whole thing falls apart. I think that's probably the most frustrating thing for me to see is huge organizations across all critical infrastructure sectors. And it's interesting because sometimes the board is the one who says we got to get a qualified CISO, and the board members are talking about security. They know that security should be a priority, but there's a disconnect because for a lot of different reasons, and I don't know if we have time to get into it, but I think that's what's the most shocking to me, kind of along the lines of what Dave was talking about. So I think we need to, I think Dave mentioned it in one of his, on the last question, having those conversations and with different, the non-technical side of your organization, what kind of addresses that, because you can see what type of company you work for, and it does require putting your neck out on the line. But the good thing is there is a workforce shortage, so if you're a CISO and you're not an organization that wants you to do anything, you can pretty darn sure find a job pretty quickly elsewhere, I think.
Yeah, and then Jen, I'll turn it over to you for the last word.
Sure. I think, so in working with healthcare organizations for the last several years, one of the most jaw-dropping things, which seems so simple, is password management. Don't share your passwords. Don't have common passwords. Don't script your passwords in. Don't share your usernames and passwords in the same email. All those sorts of things, which everyone knows have complex passwords and all those things. And yet, and this additionally is not just healthcare, but frequently where organizations are growing and scaling and everyone knows everybody, and it's just easier to have just a shared password, or everyone just knows it, and or we don't change the default one because we know each other, and and then all of a sudden they've scaled and they have hundreds of millions of records, or tens and tens of clients, and then now they're are looking at events based on really poor password practices that are very simple to really require. It's funny, Parm's note, I very quickly become the least liked person in the organization when I start working with them because I actually, put my foot down on some things, and it can be hard, but it's also good. Now, I will say one of the challenges for implementing a security and privacy program's longevity is that it's really easy to get focused on putting out those fires and forget to set up that governance structure, so your program development. And if you pay attention to what OCR is leveraging for fines and penalties these days, it's often not for the lack or failure of security rigor. It's for organizations failing to have conducted their annual HIPAA risk analysis and having a documented risk management plan. It's the governance aspect that will ensure your program will survive, and that you can adequately put out those fires and mitigate your risk and provide documented risk management to authority agencies. And so, it's kind of don't overlook the simple stuff, and remember the backbone that you've got to have in your framework, and that those are going to be some critical aspects to having a successful security and or privacy program.
Those are all great concepts and great ideas to take away. And so thank you all, all three of you for participating today and for generating a great discussion. And thank you to everyone who's been listening as well. And be sure to keep looking out for more programming.